Recent reports have uncovered a private, high-level exchange that the White House has reportedly sought to keep out of public view, marking a significant shift in diplomatic relations between the United States and Canada. For several months, Donald Trump has maintained an uncharacteristic silence regarding Canadian affairs, a move that followed a period of intense rhetoric concerning tariffs and the potential annexation of Canadian territory. This abrupt cessation of public commentary has raised questions among political analysts regarding the specific nature of the pressure applied to the administration. Investigations into the timeline of these events point to a closed-door meeting held in December 2024. During this session, the former president met with Robert Hardman, a prominent British journalist and royal commentator. While the meeting was initially intended to discuss the historical legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, the conversation reportedly pivoted toward current geopolitical ambitions involving Greenland and the North American border. The encounter took place in a private interview room without the presence of a press pool or media cameras. During the discussion, Hardman issued a direct and unprecedented warning to the president regarding his stance on Canada. The journalist explicitly stated that the president should leave Canada alone, or he would make the king very unhappy. This statement, while phrased in the polite language of the monarchy, carries significant weight within the framework of international diplomacy. The invocation of the king represents the interests of the Commonwealth, a global network of 14 sovereign nations and nearly 2.7 billion people. In diplomatic circles, the phrase, very unhappy, signals that continued actions would result in consequences moving through institutional and symbolic channels that are difficult for any single administration to counter. The context of this exchange is underscored by a notable gap in the administration's understanding of Canadian sovereignty. Reports indicate that the former president appeared surprised to learn that Canada remains a constitutional monarchy with the British king as its formal head of state. This lack of institutional knowledge stood in stark contrast to previous public statements, suggesting that Canada could be treated as a potential 51st state or subjected to extreme trade pressure. The realization of Canada's ties to the British Crown appeared to disrupt the administration's strategic calculations. While the rhetoric has since quieted, the former president has clarified that his shift in position was a matter of timing rather than a change in principle. He noted that the goals concerning Canada were simply not achievable within his remaining time in office, suggesting a postponement of the agenda rather than a complete withdrawal. The core of the December 2024 encounter reveals a fundamental disconnect between the administration's geopolitical rhetoric and the established institutional framework of North American sovereignty. According to detailed accounts of the meeting, the warning delivered by Robert Hardman was not a mere suggestion, but the drawing of a deliberate diplomatic boundary. By invoking the king, Hardman activated a symbolic and political architecture that connects Canada to a global network of influence. Analysts point out that in the specialized language of the British monarchy, expressing unhappiness serves as a formal signal of impending consequences that operate outside of standard bilateral trade negotiations. This intervention occurred at a moment when the United States was applying maximum tariff pressure and publicly entertaining the idea of Canadian annexation, a strategy that appears to have been developed without a full accounting of Canada's status as a constitutional monarchy. Documentation of the meeting indicates that the former president's reaction was one of genuine surprise regarding the king's role as Canada's head of state. This lack of situational awareness suggests that the aggressive trade and territorial policies directed toward Ottawa were formulated on the assumption that Canada stood in isolation. Following the private warning, the administration's public posture transitioned from active hostility to a conspicuous silence. However, internal justifications for this shift do not indicate a rejection of the original policy goals. Instead, the former president reportedly stated that the acquisition or absorption of Canadian territory was a project he could not achieve within the current time remaining in his mandate. This distinction between a principled retreat and a strategic postponement has significant implications for the future of the U.S.-Canada relationship, as it leaves the door open for a resumption of such policies under different temporal or political conditions. In response to this underlying threat, Ottawa has not remained static. Under the strategic direction of Mark Carney, the Canadian government has been quietly implementing a multi-layered defense of the nation's sovereignty that predates the public awareness of the December meeting. This strategy is built upon three distinct layers designed to insulate the country from unilateral American pressure. The first layer involves the aggressive diversification of trade, seeking to reduce economic dependency on the United States by strengthening ties with the European Union, Japan, and Australia. The second layer focuses on reinforcing multilateral institutional frameworks, including NATO and the Commonwealth, to create a system of collective obligations that raises the cost of any American intervention. The third and most subtle layer utilizes the historical and symbolic power of the Crown to ensure that any threat to Canada is viewed as a threat to the broader institutional stability of the Commonwealth. This proactive restructuring suggests that Canadian officials accurately gauged Washington's trajectory well before the private exchange in December became a matter of record. The long-term consequences of this diplomatic friction are now manifesting in the economic and structural realities of the North American corridor, where $900 billion in annual trade remains at stake. This figure encompasses critical supply chains in energy, agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and raw materials such as steel and aluminum. Analysts warn that the strategic pivot in Ottawa is not merely a political gesture, but a necessary response to the arithmetic of trade instability. As Canada moves to insulate its economy through its three-layered diplomatic architecture, the potential for a permanent shift in trade patterns grows. For the average citizen, these high-level maneuvers translate into the volatility of grocery prices, heating costs, and the long-term viability of manufacturing hubs that have historically relied on seamless border integration. The move toward diversification suggests a future where Canada operates with greater autonomy, potentially reducing the leverage Washington has traditionally exercised over its northern neighbor. Furthermore, the American administration's approach has incurred a measurable cost in diplomatic capital. By pushing a long-standing ally to seek alternative global partnerships, the United States risks shrinking its own sphere of influence and trading long-term regional stability for short-term political leverage. Experts in international relations suggest that the Canadian blueprint, the successful resistance of a mid-sized power against the pressure of a larger neighbor through the activation of historical and institutional frameworks, could be adopted by other nations in Europe and the Pacific. This would mark a generational shift in how smaller sovereign states manage their relationships with global superpowers, prioritizing a web of diverse obligations over bilateral dependence. The trust and institutional positioning lost during this period of tension may take decades to reconstruct, regardless of future changes in administration. As the current political term progresses, observers are monitoring three potential trajectories for the U.S.-Canada relationship. The first involves the successful validation of the Carney strategy, where Canada emerges with enhanced international credibility and a more resilient, diversified economy. The second trajectory sees a period of prolonged managed friction, where the rhetoric remains elevated, but major escalations are avoided, leaving businesses and citizens to absorb the quiet costs of persistent uncertainty. The final possibility remains the resetting of the political clock, with the former president's admission that his goals were postponed rather than abandoned. The strength of Canada's new diplomatic defenses may eventually face a more sustained challenge. Regardless of the outcome, the events of December 2024 have fundamentally altered the calculus of North American diplomacy. For more in-depth analysis on international trade and geopolitical shifts, subscribe to our updates as we continue to track these developing stories.